The Sergeant Miguel Santana was a veteran police officer from Rio de Janeiro, known for his rigidity and a history of aggressive approaches, especially against black people. Raised in a military family, he believed that maintaining order required firm authority, but this belief often translated into an unconscious and sometimes quite conscious bias against certain groups. On that sultry night, Miguel was patrolling a bohemian area of the city where bars and restaurants kept the streets busy. The air carried the smell of street barbecue, while laughter and live music mixed with the roar of motorcycle engines that crossed the avenue. That's when he noticed a black man leaning against the gate of a closed store, playing on his cell phone with a calm expression. Something about him bothered Miguel. The leather jacket, the way he looked around, he seemed suspicious. Miguel frowned. For him, black men standing alone on the street at night were a problem waiting to happen. Without thinking twice, he got out of the car and approached. "Good evening, citizen. Document and cell phone in hand, please." The man, named Lucas Andrade, raised an eyebrow and looked directly into Miguel's eyes. His tone was calm but firm. "Any reason for this approach, Sergeant?" "Standard procedure. You've been standing here for a while. Come on, don't make it difficult." Lucas sighed, but instead of taking his ID, he did something unexpected. He took a badge from his pocket and held it up for Miguel to see. In the yellow light of the streetlight, the letters were clear. Federal Police, Delegate Lucas Andrade. Miguel felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. For a moment, Sergeant Miguel Santana was paralyzed. The golden reflection of the badge Federal Police. It seemed to shine brighter than any streetlight. Lucas kept his gaze fixed on the policeman, without looking away for even a second. "So, Sergeant, do you still want to see my ID?" Miguel's anger bubbled under his skin. He didn't like being challenged, least of all by a black man who clearly didn't fit his vision of who deserves respect. He tried to disguise his nervousness with a short laugh. "It's just a procedure, you know. I didn't recognize you, Deputy." "He's out of uniform, in plain clothes." Lucas crossed his arms. "I don't need a uniform to have rights, Sergeant. Or would this approach be different if I were a white man?" Lucas's tone was calm, but loaded with something cutting. The question hung in the air like a sharp knife. Miguel felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Look, I'm just doing my job. You looked suspicious." Lucas took a step forward, closing the distance between the two. "Suspicious? Why? Why am I a black man standing in the street? Why am I not wearing a suit and tie?" Some people passing by on the sidewalk began to notice the tension in the air. Miguel felt the eyes on him, and, in his mind, the humiliation was unbearable. He needed to take back control. "Look, you may even be a police chief, but you're interfering with the police's work. What if I ask for backup now? Let's see who gets out of here first." Lucas arched his eyebrow in disbelief. "Do you really want to go through with this, Sergeant? Do you want to call your headquarters and explain that you stopped a federal deputy because he looked suspicious?" Miguel hesitated. He knew that if he called in reinforcements and the story got out, it could be a disaster for his career. But admitting the mistake was almost impossible for him. Before I could respond, another military police car arrived at the scene, with 2 agents. Quickly getting out, they looked at Miguel, then at Lucas, noticing the tension in the air. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" asked one of the agents, looking suspiciously at Lucas. Lucas, without losing his cool, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and typed something quickly. "I just sent a message to the Federal Police Internal Affairs Department. If this gets worse, the investigation into this approach begins today." Miguel swallowed dryly. He was starting to feel like the situation was getting out of his control. The question now was, would he double down or back down before it was too late? Sergeant Miguel Santana felt sweat running down the back of his neck. The heat of the Rio night seemed to have doubled in intensity, or perhaps it was the presence of the newly arrived police officers and Lucas Andrade's coldness. The federal delegate was still holding his cell phone, remaining absolutely calm. His gaze was a silent challenge, a mirror reflecting Miguel's mistakes in real time. "So, Sergeant," Lucas broke the silence, "are you going to continue insisting on this approach?" Miguel felt the weight of the eyes on him. The officers in the other car were waiting for a response. Some pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk, realizing something was happening. It was one of those moments that could easily make the news. Miguel took a deep breath, fighting the pride and anger that bubbled inside him. He could simply step back, let it go, but the idea of feeling humiliated by a black man, especially one who held a higher position than him, was unbearable. Taken by the need to reassert his power, he made the worst decision possible. "Give me your cell phone." His voice was harsh. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Sorry?" "You heard. If you really sent a message to the Internal Affairs Department, I want to see. You can consider this part of the approach." Lucas laughed through his nose in disbelief. "You know you're exceeding all limits, right?" Miguel's expression hardened. "Cell phone. Now." The surrounding police officers began to shift uncomfortably. One of them, Corporal Almeida, stepped forward. "Sergeant, maybe we'd better end this here." Miguel ignored it. He needed to come out on top. Lucas, without changing his posture, held the cell phone more firmly. "Touch me, Sergeant, and I swear that tomorrow morning your name will be on every headline in this country." Miguel clenched his fists. His instinct told him to continue, but his mind was starting to calculate the risks. Before I could do anything, the radio on his shoulder squeaked. "Sergeant Santana, report to headquarters immediately." The voice of the battalion's PM commander sounded like a punch in the stomach. Miguel realized that the situation had already gotten out of his control. Lucas probably had powerful contacts and wasn't bluffing about internal affairs. Miguel closed his eyes for a brief second and let out a sigh. Then, without saying anything else, he turned his back and walked to his patrol car. Lucas stood still, watching. The tension in the air slowly dissolved, but something had changed. The sergeant knew his battle was just beginning. The vehicle was cutting through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, but Miguel Santana was barely paying attention to the road. His mind was racing. Upon arriving at the military police headquarters, he noticed the heavy atmosphere. Some colleagues avoided his gaze. The commander Vasconcelos, a man with slow speech and a rigid posture, was waiting for him in the office. "Sergeant, sit down." Miguel obeyed. The commander crossed his arms and sighed. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was just doing my job, sir." The man was standing in a suspicious location. "The man, Miguel? Or the Negro?" The question cut like a blade. Silence settled. "Delegate Lucas Andrade filed a formal complaint against you." Vasconcelos threw a folder on the table. "And it wasn't just him. Internal Affairs has been keeping an eye on you for a while now. This is not the first time that his approaches have raised suspicions." Miguel swallowed dryly. "Sir, I'm not interested in excuses. The entire battalion is being tarnished by this. You are away from street duty for an indefinite period." It was like a punch in the stomach. "Away? But, sir, the decision has already been made. You have two options. You can continue to think you did nothing wrong and end up expelled from the corporation. Or you can use this time to review your attitudes." The weight of the words hung in the air. In the following days, Miguel felt the change around him. Some colleagues in uniform stopped talking to him, while others whispered as he passed by. The media picked up the story, but the worst was the conversation with his son, Gabriel, 16 years old. "Dad, you really stopped that guy just because he was black?" Miguel tried to argue to say that it was protocol, that anyone could look suspicious. But Gabriel's expression dismantled him. "I'm black, Dad. Me." Have you ever thought about what would have happened if I were in his place? The question kept ringing in Miguel's mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt something different: doubt. Miguel Santana spent his days away from the streets, tied to administrative tasks at the police station. It was humiliating. He always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who commanded respect. Now, he was a ghost within the battalion. The headlines were still circulating. Sergeant dismissed after racist approach to federal police delegate. With each piece of news, his pride fragmented a little more. But what really shook him was the conversation with Gabriel, his own son, a young black man growing up in a city where skin color could be a sentence. "Dad, have you ever wondered? Why did you think that guy was suspicious?" Gabriel's question echoed in Miguel's mind for days. He tried to ignore it. You tried to convince yourself that you were right, until he received an unexpected message. Lucas Andrade wanted to see him. The meeting was arranged in a discreet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the media. When Miguel arrived, he saw Lucas already sitting, calmly drinking a coffee. He greeted him with a curt wave. "I never thought I would have this conversation," Miguel said, trying to appear indifferent. Lucas smiled slightly. "Neither do I." There was a heavy silence between the two before Lucas broke it. "I didn't make this report because I want to ruin your life, Sergeant. I did it because need to change." Miguel stirred his coffee cup, avoiding the other man's gaze. "I was just doing my job." "Do you really think so?" Lucas leaned his body forward. "If I were white, dressed the same, standing in the same place, would you have approached me?" Miguel opened his mouth, but found no answer. "You're not the first police officer with this problem," Lucas continued. "But he may be one of the few to really see." Miguel closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. He hated to admit it, but he knew Lucas was right. Now, he had a choice. He could continue deceiving himself, blaming the system, clinging to his pride, or he could face the truth and try to change. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "What can I do?" Lucas Andrade analyzed Miguel for a few seconds, as if he was evaluating whether he really wanted to know the answer. Then he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You can start by listening." Miguel frowned. "Listening to what?" "The people you treated as suspects just because they were black. Colleagues who know that racism exists in the police, but are afraid to speak out. And most importantly, your own son." The mention of Gabriel made Miguel look away. "Do you want me to become an activist now?" Miguel grumbled in a bitter tone. Lucas laughed through his nose. "No, Sergeant. I want that you become a better police officer." Silence hovered between the two. For the first time, Miguel felt that he was not being attacked, but rather challenged to be different. The next day, when he returned to the battalion, Miguel made a difficult decision. He approached Commander Vasconcelos and asked to be included in training on racial bias in the corporation. Vasconcelos raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Are you sure?" Miguel took a deep breath. "I have. In the following weeks." Miguel began attending lectures, talking to black officers and hearing reports from citizens who had been unfairly approached. For the first time, he tried to see the other side of the story. But the most difficult moment came when he sat down with Gabriel for a sincere conversation. "Son, I never wanted to be the kind of person you would fear meeting on the street." Gabriel watched him for a moment, his eyes full of conflicting emotions. "I know, Dad, but what matters is not what you wanted to be. It's what you choose to be now." The phrase was recorded in Miguel's mind. In the end, he couldn't erase his past mistakes, but he could choose do not repeat them in the future. And that, he realized, was the only possible redemption. 2 years had passed since the night Miguel Santana tried to impose his authority over Lucas Andrade. A lot had changed since then. The sergeant now held a new position within the military police, instructor at new officer training course. It was a role he never imagined for himself, but one that, in some ways, felt like a necessary fit. That morning, he walked through the battalion auditorium where a group of young cadets were intently watching a seminar on community policing. On stage, a speaker spoke about the impact of racial bias in police approaches. Miguel already knew that speech by heart, but hearing it still sent a chill down his spine. 2 years ago, he would have rolled his eyes and joked about it. Now he listened, because I knew it was true. When the lecture ended, he approached the speaker to greet him. "Good work, Dr. Andrade." Lucas Andrade smiled as he shook his hand. "I never thought I'd see you in a place like this, Sergeant." "Neither do I." They both laughed briefly. They weren't friends, but there was a mutual respect there, built on conflict and change. That night, upon returning home, Miguel found Gabriel in the living room, now a young university student studying for a test. He sat down next to his son and watched him for a moment. "I never asked you, what do you think of what I do now?" Gabriel smirked. "I think you still have a lot to learn, but at least now are you trying?" Miguel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Fair." They were silent for a moment. Then Gabriel spoke without taking his eyes off the book. "You know, Dad, if all the police were like you are now, maybe I would feel a little safer on the street." Miguel stopped. That wasn't a compliment, but it was as close to redemption as he could get. And for the first time, he felt at peace with that.